Welcome back to Power and Market. I'm Ryan McMakin, executive editor at the Mises Institute, and this is our weekly current events podcast. Welcome back to listening. We were off last week because of the long holiday weekend, and so we got plenty to talk about here in terms of what's been going on the last couple of weeks. And I would say that overall, it hasn't been a great week if you've been like a diehard, never question the plan sort of Trump supporter. And we'll get into some of the details of that going forward in this hour. And with me, as always, are two of our contributing editors here at the Mises Institute. We've got Tho Bishop, whose columns surely you're familiar with by now. And also we're getting weekly columns from Connor O'Keefe, who's also here with us today. And of course, if you haven't seen it, you should check out his Guns and Butter podcast, where he provides some weekly commentary there as well. So, guys, let's talk about maybe what it feels like to be a diehard Trump supporter. Now, I'm not talking about someone who thought that Trump was better than Kamala and thought, hey, I'm going to vote for Trump because I want to stop insane things that the Democratic Party is doing. There's many millions of those people. I'm talking about the sort of person, and of course, we at the Mises Institute have encountered this person for a while now. We encountered them during the first Trump term. These are the people who, no matter what, always convinced themselves that everything Trump was doing was brilliant strategy, unquestionable, just the most amazing thing ever. And he's totally on the side of good, and he's going to bring down all the bad guys any day now. And also, if you encounter them online, much like how if anyone who, say, opposed the Iraq war would encounter these sorts of people back in 2003, they would call you a communist or an Al Gore clone or something like that. It was
unpatriotic conservative.
Right. Unpatriotic, a traitor, maybe. These people have a hard time kind of comprehending that it's okay, it's possible to support someone relative to someone else and still criticize them and still think that that person is not perfect. But we're encountering a lot of those people just on a daily basis, really, in the work we do. But what is this sort of person then to make of recent developments, right? There are several things we can talk about. We can talk about just how the Trump administration just keeps coming up either straight up empty, straight up reversing itself, straight up like failing in terms of, oh, Trump decides he's going to send more weapons to Ukraine now. Hey, do you remember when Trump promised to end the Ukraine war on day one? Do you remember when Trump promised within 90 days to create a bunch of trade deals so that the U.S. would have all these, would basically have like 0 for 0 tariff deals with all of these countries, but he was going to extract concessions? None of that stuff has happened. And then, of course, he promised to release the Epstein list, which they assured us existed and was like sitting on Pam Bondi's desk. And then this week, it all just disappeared. And we were told, no, there was never such list. Epstein didn't kill himself, or Epstein did kill himself. The official story is 100% correct about Epstein. And then when Trump was asked about it in a press conference a day later, he's like, are we still talking about that? Are we still talking about the rapes of teenage girls? How boring. Let's move on. So that seems to be where the Trump administration is now. And I still seen a little bit of I've seen a few posts which have been reduced to complete gobbledygook, really, in terms of trying to create an explanation of how this is like 7D chess, that Trump has refusing to engage on the Epstein issue anymore as part of some big plan that will unfold itself in the coming months. But I don't see how this can be interpreted as anything other than a fairly big blow to that whole thing. And I think further just illustrates the larger narrative of the Trump administration dealing a death blow to the deep state or any of that, man, there is zero reason to believe anything like that is going on. Again, none of that says, oh, yes, we should have voted for Kamala. Kamala would have been much better. But it's also possible to have someone better than Kamala who's also no threat whatsoever to the overall power of the state, to the deep state, to the national security state that greatly endangers our freedoms, that all that stuff is perfectly safe and sound, and Trump isn't going to do anything about it at all. So I mean, I bet you have opinions about this, though. I mean, you follow this world much more closely than I do. I just encounter these people on social media and stuff. I mean, how is the whole Epstein thing being received in that world?
Well, it's not good, Ryan. It's not good. And when I try to think about politics, I try to think of it from the eyes of the consumer, right? So we can have our critiques about policy and this, that, and the other. And I think within some of the issues that you laid, there's some interesting components with all three that are different in some ways, but go to this larger theme of, concern, failure, some people kind of questioning the plan, if you will. Like the trade policies, I think that's probably the area where you're going to get the most, okay, we'll see how things play out, right? I think that's kind of the one that until people start feeling the pain of the tariff rates, right? We saw Amazon Prime Day had very low behavior there. There's a little bit of that economic uneasiness that goes into that. But I think the two other stories, though, are very interesting from different perspectives. One, the reversal in the Ukraine funding is interesting because I think that kind of reflects a genuine personnel dispute within that. Elbridge Colby, who's works at the Pentagon, he's someone who kind of was leading the charge on removing arms support for Ukraine, and he got kind of got burnt by that, and so I think that represents kind of an actual divide there. The other side, though, is I think far more interesting because to me the Epstein files are more important than the specific details of the case in terms of this kind of general myth. And I don't mean that as an admissive way, but like the theory of the case for why Trump was so unique. And a big part of this goes back to even like the folklore of QAnon, right? Like I kind of view QAnon as sort of West Wing for MAGA, or like West Wing back in the day, right? Like it was this very uplifting narrative, right? That liberal politics is being governed by these golly gosh darn super smart policy wonks that just want to give everyone free, good government, right? And it was a comforting narrative that Democrats had, particularly in the Bush years, that don't worry, we've got competent, good people on our side, and we're on the side of the angels. The QAnon stuff, though, was different. Very much newer age, right? It was very online. But the underlying narrative, right, is don't worry, patriots are in command. Yes, we are governed by evil people. This plays into the vulgarization of politics and the demonization of everyone around. But don't worry, we've got things on lockdown here. Patriots are in control. Trust the plan. I mean, trust the plan came from this. And that, I think, is very different now. Because for one, I mean, obviously QAnon was at most, at best fan fiction, at worst a psyop. And then ignoring the foreign policy component to it and the interesting connections there. Epstein was a face. There were names. It was a concrete example of that more narrow narrative played out in real life. And this has been something that Donald Trump Jr. was talking about. All the MAGA podcasts were talking about, and not having justice on this goes against the gut knowledge of what Trump supporters know is the problem of government, which is that it's not simply that we get bad laws, but these are bad people. And so this really, I think, hits on a very emotional level in a way that some of these other policy debates and discussions and other, it's a lot more visceral. And so you're seeing a lot harder time, I think, digesting that. And, the potential domestic political fallout for it going forward, I think is something that, again, Trump's dismissive questioning there kind of seems to indicate that there's perhaps an underestimation on just how big of a blow I think this is to what motivated so many people to kind of take up their red MAGA hats.
Well, what is your observation on this, Connor?
Yeah, I love
how
that.
bad is it?
I love that framing of it's like the West Wing for MAGA. And I really think like if you step back and just look at the last few years, I remember actually talking about this with you, though, in the middle of the whole storm where they were really going after Trump with the felony cases. But if you just kind of zoom back, like the establishment, the political class in DC was obviously not happy about him winning the first time around. And the approach they took was to try to essentially force him out of office. First it was, they considered the 25th Amendment. And then there was the whole Russiagate thing, Mueller, all that stuff. When that kind of petered out, they tried to impeach him a few times. But then, he lost the election in 2020. And then it was all about disqualifying him from coming back. And I remember right after he left office, it felt like that had been pretty effective. He kind of disappeared from public life for like basically the whole year of 2021, as far as I remember. And, they kicked him off of social media. And then like as he was running, he was starting to gain momentum. Some people tried to really take that same approach, and like I think it was two states, right? I think Colorado, where you are, Ryan, and Maine. I want to say tried to like take him off the ballot. Obviously, the felony cases were sort of this attempt to disqualify him, if not legally, at least in the minds of the American people. So that was like their whole approach here. But I remember just at the time, and I remember talking to you about it, though, it just seemed like such a incredibly counterproductive effort, because their whole every state, and like Rothbard writes about this in Anatomy of the State, it's like right there at the beginning, every state has to have legitimacy in the eyes of the public. That is like the most basic ingredient for being a government. Before you can do anything else, you have to, the population, enough of the population has to view you as legitimate. And for the United States government, their whole claim to legitimacy is them being a democracy, that they are an embodiment of the will of the people. So everything they do they're doing it, by definition, because we live in a democracy, by definition, it's what the people want. And if you're opposing what they're doing, then you're like this, selfish person that's opposing what everybody wants. And that's like so central to the whole narrative of like what our government is. It goes all the way back to the beginning with the American Revolution. It's never about like opposing taxes. It's opposing taxes without representation. So like we have the representation now. So like, we could just kick back. We're all good with this federal government. So that is so central to their entire claim to power, and just the optics of trying to take this popular candidate and use these shady legal means to prevent him from coming back just seemed like such a short-term thinking. And like, if they were successful with that, you're essentially convincing a huge portion of the country that voting doesn't work, that this whole system that, you've been raised to believe is a democracy is just a big illusion. Now, we think that's true, but it would be a huge step towards convincing a lot more people in the country that that's true if if the establishment was successful in those efforts. So like, to me, I was like, that seems like a terrible, if you're just looking at it value free, that seems like a really bad strategy. I thought that the much more effective strategy would be to maybe not let Trump win, but to kind of pull back on all that stuff. And I thought the best case scenario would be that Trump actually wins, and then they're able to kind of take a more gentle approach and essentially have their people, have the, same old establishment Republicans co-opt a lot of the actual Trump administration and have him govern just like he was any other run-of-the-mill establishment Republican. And I thought that the risk there would be, from our perspective now, that a huge portion of Trump's base would be like, just because Trump is the one doing it and because he calls it America first, they're going to be completely fine with him governing in a completely, status quo way. And that all of this sort of anti-establishment energy that I thought had really been ginned up in the last few years would kind of peter out. I thought that was the big risk as I saw it. And so, yeah, like I did enjoy election night. I did enjoy watching the establishment once again lose. And, I very much don't like these people. So watching them lose was fantastic. And I really enjoyed myself that night. But I kind of personally expected that to sort of be the peak. And I thought it would just kind of get more frustrating from then on. And so like, I am, especially as you're saying, Ryan, after the last few weeks, pleased with my decision to go into the second Trump administration with absolutely no expectations, thinking that he wouldn't really do anything good. The thing is, though, to what you were just talking about, though, is I have actually been kind of pleased with how a good portion of his base, not as many as I would like, but more than I expected, have been very vocal that they don't like certain things that he's doing. They haven't all fallen in line just because he's calling whatever he's doing America first. And so, like, yeah, I don't love where we are. I think we have, like, I was not one of these people that thought just because he got elected, like, that's a huge step and we're only, a few years away from essentially draining the swamp. Like that I was never convinced by any of that sort of starry-eyed talk. But even though I went in with a bit of a pessimistic mindset here, it is nice to see like Trump supporters and vocal Trump influencers or MAGA influencers calling him out for, that terrible answer he gave about the Epstein stuff, and just not rolling over immediately. That's productive. And, I just hope that I think it comes down to those of us that, are not pure partisans to get really loud about this stuff, and hopefully that translates, and more parts of the MAGA base can kind of, those that are capable of thinking beyond just the pure team sport dynamic of politics can kind of see like, yeah, okay, we shouldn't just judge something because Trump is doing it. We should judge, what it is, sort of regardless of which president is, enacting whatever policy. So I don't know. I guess I'm generally a pessimist. Not a great few weeks here, but there have been some silver linings.
Well, the biggest silver lining, I think, for the people who generally support Trump, not necessarily slavishly support Trump, but just generally support him, is the immigration issue. And I think he's managed to please his base on that. Whatever your opinion is of the policy, he promised a certain thing. And at least outwardly, I mean, I haven't studied the exact details and it's hard to get any real data on anything. But at least in terms of optics, looks like a lot of people are being deported. Looks like the border is pretty much closed. So on that issue, pretty supportive. And that's certainly not helping. That's not hurting him with, say, any particular interest group that might have, well, any particular demographic group that had supported him in 2020 or in 2020. Because if you look at, what always pleases me are discussions about the Hispanic vote. And I keep seeing these headlines to the effect of, shockingly, Hispanics are growing in their support of Donald Trump. And this is not shocking at all if you actually know middle-class Hispanics. And in fact, I can think of, specifically speaking to the issue of how people who generally like him supported him for the immigration issue, one Mexican woman I know who's related to me said, the one thing I voted for Trump for was immigration. That is the one thing I wanted to happen. So she's fairly happy about that. Then a friend of mine is not related to me, but looks like he just arrived like from Mexico City circa 1490. I mean, the guy looks like 100% Aztec, right? He's from LA like me. And I remember him just like pumping his fists when he heard about how the deportations were starting in California. So, I mean, he's got plenty of support broadly, I think, for that issue. And I think that's helping him a lot. But if that's not your only issue, if that's not your major issue, you're going to see a lot of cracks, I think, in what's going on here. And then keep in mind, too, that the economy is still okay, right? If you're actually looking at the data, the economy is not good by any means. The only people think the economy is good are people who like own 3 houses, have tons of assets, who benefit from monetary inflation and want interest rates to go lower so that home prices will go up even farther and screw over young people and first-time home buyers. Those sorts of people think things are fine, because they benefit from the inflationary system that we live under and which Trump wants. And that's why we're seeing Trump constantly ask for lower interest rates and more inflation. But for normal people, things are lousy. And even the Fed itself says that in half of the Fed districts in America, things are either flat, that is stagnant, or actually getting worse in terms of the economic situation. So a lot of people hurting out there. And we're kind of just, I've seen it well described. They're like, whatever this is the phrase that's used, right? Everybody's saying, oh, we're not in recession. And then the response is, well, whatever this is certainly isn't a good economy, because people have a sense of what the reality is out there. But things haven't gotten really worse. We're not seeing, the housing thing is just starting now with all this massive amount of inventory on the market. We're starting to see rents actually go down, which shows, I think, the reality of what people have to spend. Delinquencies on things like automobiles, credit cards are going to all-time highs. But we still aren't seeing mass layoffs. As I showed in some posts, though, we're not seeing any hires either. So companies, they're not engaging in mass layoffs, but they're not hiring anybody either. So this is what we would call a not terrible economy, but nothing to be excited about, especially if you have children maybe, or who are like graduating from school soon and they're going to enter the job market. It's going to be terrible for them. So we look at that and how things aren't that bad. And Trump is still already doing a whole lot to essentially betray his base, to cause himself real problems in terms of approval. And just wait until the economy starts to look bad, and then he might start to regret some of that.
Well, it's really not a good sign when like the number one talking point that you're getting about the economy is the stock market. Now, obviously, you're invested, then hey, golly gosh darn, you're doing great. But like the stock market back in like June 2024 was better than it was. It was reaching all-time highs there. Like if during the Obama years, with how bad that recovery was for the real economy, the stock market was still doing fine, right? That's the whole byproduct of most of our government policies to make sure stocks go up, right? And like that became the meme on the right, as the wrong way of measuring the economy. But that's the number one talking point because that's really the best data out there on the economic side of things. And again, that's probably a red flag there. The other side of it, though, is that even the immigration issue is that there's a lot of concern, right? You have people from certain interest groups that are really sort of pounding the table saying, look, you can't do these immigration crackdowns. You can't do this. You can't do this. I think there's reports out there that Joe Rogan is kind of discouraging that. And that's kind of goes into some interesting conversation about the broader Trump coalition and things like that. Again, regardless of your opinion, right? Like that's just, so immigration is again one of those tent pole issues there. Like if you told me like what was the coalition that Trump had in 2024, it would be the MAGA, anti-COVID blowback stuff, right? Which again, we can talk about 2020 and who was president at the time, right? Whatever, it was weird, but it worked, right? It worked politically. It was immigration, and it was stories like the Epstein case. And so now all the three of those tent poles with the new mRNA, Moderna stuff, and that's outside of my wheelhouse. I'm not giving a strong scientific opinion one way or another about that, but that's obviously something that a large percentage of that base distrusts, and to see that fly through. And so again, the reason why I think this is relevant for a libertarian podcast, like why are we caring about Trump? Everything the government does is bad, yada, 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 all valid opinions from a libertarian audience. To me, the interesting thing about this is what it says about broader sentiment about how the population, or at least half the population, maybe a third of the population, views the state itself. And kind of to Connor's point, like what the Trump 24 election was, that one big thing, right? That one big action item that people thought would change things, and however vague that is, right? You vote for this one guy, he's going to make these some systemic changes. And those are three of the key issues that people focused on. Now, when that doesn't work, right? When people come out, when people voted, if they feel let down, right? Regardless of what you think about other policies, whatever. When that belief that goes into the perception of what is achievable through the political process, at least nationally, is undermined, then that impact on the broader concept of how we are governed, these much more deeper fundamental issues, that changes. And so again, maybe a month from now, no one cares, right? In which case, this entire sort of vibe analysis here is off base. But again, I think these are very real cracks because again, these are the specific sort of things that people expected change of, and if people are not satisfied with the plan, if you will, then that is going to change. What do people move on to next? Is it nullification? Let's hope so. Is it okay? We're going to return back to the old Republican Party. Is it going to be more politics as usual? Is it going to be something more radical there? That I think is the more interesting conversation to be had in terms of what does the country, or at least a large percentage of the country, look going forward in terms of how do you remedy these obvious issues that people have with very, very deep systemic baked in concerns. That again, on when it comes to a lot of this sort of stuff, is very compatible with the way that we view Washington as a whole.
Well, I think it's nice from our perspective is that it continues to undermine sort of the naive view of how the democratic system works, right? Think about it. You fought tooth and nail to get this guy Trump elected, who we were told right by the other side would basically cause civil war, just completely destroy the country. Who knows what other doom predictions were happening. And so then you get him in, and you have all of these things that you hope he'll do: end various wars, maybe cut the runaway government spending, or at least maybe just flatten it out. Not even cut it, just stop it from going up at crazy levels. Maybe end price inflation, just get that to go flat for a while. And then none of that materializes. You get the one thing, which was the deportations and all of that, which you wanted. And we have yet to see just how effective that's going to be. I mean, we've got Trump supporters telling us that there's 12 million. Heck, I saw one estimate of 40 million. I don't believe that one, but we got people telling us there's 12 million. And then Trump is saying, oh man, we're going full speed ahead. We're going to do 1 million deportations a year. Okay, well, that's definitely an improvement, but that ain't what his supporters were hoping for, especially since we know that because the GOP and Trump are unwilling to change statute in any way, the minute Trump is gone, if anyone who's slightly more moderate on the immigration issue comes in, it doesn't even have to necessarily be some crazy far left person, then it's just going to be back to what we would consider like Obama era business as usual in terms of immigration. Yeah, probably maybe not be as insane as under Biden, but it's just going to go back to, it's going to be an open border, not totally open, but it's going to be a lot of immigration again. So you're going to get there, the leftover 8 million illegals plus whoever new is coming in. So, I mean, you got a sort of partial reprieve for a few years and then it's over. And that's what you fought tooth and nail for in the year 2024. How do you come away from that and think, yeah, democracy, it really reflects my values. It worked, guys. We voted real hard and it worked. It didn't work, obviously, if you're one of these people. We got more war. He's saying he's sending more weapons. There's nothing going on there that could be described as good. These people are going to be feeling real bad once we start to get a bigger and bigger debt crisis, which we're barreling toward every minute of every day as the debt accelerates, as we're looking at 1 trillion. We're soon to be in 5 years, maybe looking at $2 trillion a year paid to just debt service for paying interest on the debt, eating up more and more of the budget. That's just money flushed down the toilet in terms of tax collections. And Trump's doing absolutely nothing about that. So congratulations, you guys. You got some low-level deportation stuff that'll be quickly reversed. That's democracy, I guess. That's the most you can hope for. I don't know how long that system can persist, where you're told that if you vote real hard and give a lot of money and pray and hope and bust your ass to get this guy elected, maybe you get a tiny little scrap of what you wanted. But you know who will come out fine? The permanent government, the national security state, the people who are continuing to make 6 or even 7 figures off of you while you're struggling to afford some pasta down at the Kroger's. I mean, that's what people are going to come away with this, hopefully, thinking.
Well, and just one kind of touch point there, too, is that, of course, one jilted Trump supporter, Elon Musk, right? Like, I'm interested to see what he does, because if his solution, right, after being burnt like this is just, the answer to these profound systemic problems, the answer to our national debt crisis is is a third political party. Well, then if someone that's smart, if that's his takeaway, then maybe we're overestimating the ability for people to digest. I have a feeling, we'll see what comes of that. But like that again, to me, if that is what Elon Musk comes up to as the solution to what we've seen play out right now, maybe there's not enough hope out there.
Well, I wanted to ask you guys about that. Like, what are some of the potential directions that could go if, like, you essentially have a huge portion of the population that gets disillusioned with our political system? I mean, to me, I think there are a number of like productive and very counterproductive ways that could go. Like you were talking about, Ryan, it could kind of peter out and it could sort of turn into this nihilism that like it's never going to work. So I guess we'll just go back and sort of, let our foot off the gas and go back to the status quo. I think it could also go like there's sort of the scary option, which is like that whole cliche that if the ballot isn't working, turn to bullets. I think the FBI would be very happy if some people thought that like direct action, like militia stuff is the right answer. I think that would be incredibly counterproductive, be very good for the FBI's budget. But I think to me, there's sort of two things. I think one is kind of a disillusionment with, or not really disillusionment, but a better understanding of the bureaucracy. I think this is what I was hoping to see out of Elon Musk. But to your point, it doesn't seem like it seems like he's gone in a different direction. But just coming in like Musk and a lot of his supporters and like all the Doge people were talking about how damaging the bureaucracy was, but they didn't seem to have a good understanding of like just how institutionally entrenched it really is. I think if you kind of move on from the Milton Friedman and get to like Murray Rothbard has that great essay, I'm forgetting the title. It's like the civil service and bureaucracy or something like that. It's a long one, but it's great. And he's just going over the history of it and showing how entrenched all this stuff is. So not having like this idea that if we just vote the right president in, the president himself will just go get rid of all this stuff. It's a really difficult thing to do. It's possible, but I think it's possible. But it's really difficult, and it was clear that like a lot of the people in this movement did not have a full understanding of that. That said, there were some that I think did have a good understanding of the bureaucracy, and I go back to I'm still very happy. I think it was very clarifying to read the entirety of Project 2025's mandate for leadership, their booklet beforehand. It did give a very good layout of like not just the bureaucracy, but like specifically like the positions within these agencies that are like, you could easily look them over, but like this, like vice chair for like whatever it is like very powerful. It's a really good explanation for how this stuff actually works. But what was so frustrating about Project 2025, and I think it reflects a broader, idea in this whole movement, is like they were so quick to bat aside the idea that we can realistically abolish any of these agencies. They would just say that that's unrealistic. And so instead, they would just start talking as if there was just a complete, full MAGA conservative takeover of all these institutions. And then they had complete control over them. And then they would just be able to use these organizations however they wanted. They talked as if what was a lot more realistic than abolishing something like the Department of Education was for the Department of Education to just be a MAGA organization for the rest of time. I think that's another important point. It's like they're always talking as if the Democrats, as if the progressives will never come back into power. And like that is, in fact, how the Democrats were talking back during Biden's administration. Everybody that's always trying to expand government power and bring in all these new government programs, they all start with the very ahistorical assumption that the people that hate them will never control those, new programs, those new departments. And that's just never been true. And so I would really hope that, and I think, not that we're our movement is a huge or big enough voice in this space, but, we do have at least some control over the narrative, especially if we're kind of the loudest making these specific points. But I think if we could really drill down like those 2 points, that like draining the swamp is actually a very difficult thing to do, and we need to be really serious if we're going to go, or if somebody's going to go into Washington and try to do that. It is like an all hands on deck effort. And also, maybe we should explore the idea of like actually draining the swamp and like rolling back a lot of the power in DC, rather than getting seduced by these like fantasies that we will just control this for the rest of the time. And we can, now that we got the right people in power, we can just use the government for good. That's how I hope this can be manifested. I hope that we can do whatever we can to try to make that the narrative if Trump continues down this bad path. I think, however that's going to be defined in the minds of the American people is really important. But I don't know. I'm not super optimistic that, at least where things stand are now, that's going to be the takeaway.
Nor should you be optimistic, because this is the exact same thing people were saying in the years after the Reagan administration. Because when Reagan came in and the government's the problem, we need to take apart the federal government. That was when they invented the phrase. Boy, Tho, do you remember this phrase? Like you go to Washington thinking it's a swamp, but you come away treating it like a day spa or something like that, right? I'm probably butchering the saying, but the idea was, during the Reagan years, you had all of these do-gooders, these conservative, back then conservative, I guess some were maybe libertarians. They're going to Washington. They're like, we're going to fix these things. They get there and then they just become part of the machine. And then they decide, we can use the power in Washington to fix all of these problems. I mean, the current problem is absolutely the same thing. Nobody's learned anything, except the people who were doing that in the Reagan years are now really old or dead. And so now you got a new generation coming in, and I guess they didn't talk to those people or learn anything from those people, because now they're just repeating the experience. This is why, and Tho and I have talked about this on, previous podcasts of various names and types, is the only real way out of this is to create some sort of competing power center. The only way you start to chip away at centralized powers by creating decentralized power, polycentric power, where you have other elites in other places that can compete and in some way undermine the elites in Washington, D.C. So anyone who's affiliated with the Trump movement who thinks that concentrating more power in Washington or just at least not breaking it down in some way is going to some way solve the problem, they're just completely wrong. I mean, history has shown over and over again. The only way that you can even begin to deal with this problem is to defund Washington, make it chaotic, make it a mess, make people hate it, to provide people with faith in government again, to get people to think that Washington is well run. That's the worst thing you can do. That's the most anti-freedom thing you can do, is to get people to respect Washington, D.C. again on any level. The only thing they should be doing is undermining it, making it look like horrible mess, making it look like chaos in every possible way. And if they leave it a burning wreck, that would be a great service to America. But they're not, because a lot of these people are going to want to stay there. They're going to want to have jobs. They're going to want to have prestige, and they're going to want to have a lot of money for speaking tours and such when they get out of it. They're going to go into their think tanks. For the next time there's a Democrat in office, they're going to do their 4 years at the think tank. And then when the Republican gets back in, they get appointed back to the new administration. That's how the game is played, and has nothing to do with breaking down Washington's power. And all these Trump people are playing the exact same game, except for the tiny percentage of diehards, who are the people that people in the administration are listening to less and less with every passing moment. So, I mean, they're just following the same path I've seen many times before.
The one thing I think is interesting is I know DeSantis was out there talking about like the Convention of States stuff. And I think it would be a mistake to kind of take this romantic view as like, golly gosh darn, we're just going to get a Convention of States together and do an Article 5 convention, and we're going to wave a magic wand and we're going to get a balanced budget. But like, if there's enough distrust in terms of the process of reforming Washington, and you get something like that, and then you play into the hands of very well organized people that could, create all sorts of crazy things there. Not that you're necessarily going to get a good outcome from something like that, but if you have a runaway convention there, that would, I think, break a lot of the historical tradition that so much of the Constitution, sacred sort of oath is kind of really underpinning a lot of this stuff, particularly in this increasingly politicized world. So I'm not saying it's going to happen 6 years from now, 10 years from now, whatever. But if we're trying to think about, what is the sort of steps that would go about to really start, I think, reconsidering the union, if you will. I think that is a mechanism that comes up every few years, right? I mean, it's kind of like, all sorts of various, Tea Party, sort of, boomer constitutional sort of stuff. That's the one thing that I think could really actually kind of cut at the core of the tradition, which so much of the current political system, relies upon right now. But just throwing it out there is something to consider.
Well, and that addresses the issue, too, of how really the only solution is probably going to end up being quasi-legal at all, right? If our concern is, well, we can only do political things that follow just what we've always regarded as politically courteous, politically acceptable, that has established legality, that has some sort of political tradition within the regime, that's never going to go anywhere. And I mean, the perfect example is Elon's stupid political party idea. Let's just do a slight variation on what we've always been doing. That'll solve the problem. I mean, it's idiotic.
When it goes to that point, and that's more than just words, right? The language used in politics has become a lot more vulgar. It's a lot less romantic. But still, again, to use your example of the people that just kind of coast around the think tank world in between administrations, right? They're not worried about prosecution. And until you start until being part of the previous administration, and get not the best example considering you did have a few folks that like Steve Bannon and stuff go to jail during the Trump year. I get that, but until if someone like Fauci is not seriously worried about ending up down there in alligator Alcatraz, right? That's what real reform looks like. Right, or the other side, right? Until you really break down, and again, this can there are going to be people saying, this is not a good thing. It's like, well, it's not a good thing, but the political status quo is not a good thing. But until you really start having people that are involved within the power vacuum of Washington, really start fearing the consequences of it, then I think that the romantic trappings and the lifestyle and all that sort of stuff is still kind of baked in the pie, where it's going to be very difficult to have anything that resembles any sort of real radical considerations for how the system operates at hand.
I think the other thing that's often left out when we're kind of looking out is how important crises are for all this stuff. Obviously there's that Bob Higgs book, Crisis and Leviathan. If you just look back, the biggest changes in our political system have happened during crises, whether they be world wars or Great Depressions or pandemics, after serious terrorist attacks. And I really think the reason for that is because most people are not obsessed about politics. They're not ideologues one way or the other. They're not even really paying any attention to this stuff. And so they don't really want, big radical changes that are going to affect their lives. And it seems like the political class understands that. They're not pushing to jump to, like some, like domestic totalitarian system as fast as they possibly can. Because I think they know that would be disastrous. People would hate that if that just, on some random Tuesday, all of that changed. And I think the same is sort of true in the other direction. I think in the same way that crisis, and I'm not saying like we should be manufacturing crises to pivot the country in more productive directions, but the country does pivot during periods of crisis, and it can pivot in a very counterproductive direction or a productive direction. I think if you look at essentially the last few years, I think it's clear that during all the big crises like COVID, the Great Recession after 9/11, like the political establishment really used those to move things in the direction that they preferred, and they did so by sort of I think the propaganda was a huge component to that. And I think if you're looking out on the horizon, like there are a lot of things stirring that, and you can never predict how any of this will go, but because of past policies, there are a lot of crises that are could very much appear in the near future. And obviously we talk a lot about the economy, like the Fed, like the amount of money printing that happened just during the pandemic, not to mention all of everything before that wasn't even really corrected for during the pandemic. Like there's some serious economic pain baked in, and that might hit like, I don't know, next year or so. And that is a major, that would become like the major component of this Trump term. And you look like you have a point, though.
Yeah, well, I was just going to jump in and say, like, what I think is an interesting dynamic of the current process is because of just how polarized we are as a country. I know that you've written an article about the kind of the political response to the Texas floods. I mean, just an absolutely heinous tragedy. Bill Anderson wrote something similar. Is that back 9/11, right? It was a unifying moment. Even to a certain extent, though, you did have the Tea Party and you had Occupy Wall Street, and I recognize that there was a broader, I think, trust in the ability of government to recover from an economic crisis. When we think of issues of war, right? Obviously, you had massive Democrat disillusionment for partisan reasons during the War on Terror, but in the short term, there was a large unifying sense during that. Can you imagine what sort of crisis would develop a sense of kind of universal, everyone kumbaya sort of moment, right? I mean, we saw it with the strikes in Iran, right? You had people on the America First right that opposed it. You had Democrats that reflexively opposed it, right, who probably would have no problem if it was Biden. With the Russia stuff, right, you had a growing polarized view on that. COVID, extremely polarizing. And I think this goes to this other dynamic is that, get some of these binds, again, things have become so politicized. I mean, even if you are not an explicitly political creature, you're now consuming a lot of this content secondhand with nonstop social media and things like that, right? That, the growing polarization of everything. And again, some people would say that's a bad thing. Personally, I think there's some good things for it, right? Like, it's much better to view things polarized and thinking that, everyone, golly gosh darn, there's common sense solutions if everyone just get along, right? But I think that's an element to it. The more we see crises politicized and the less unifying they are, I think that undermines some of the tools at the disposal of the state in order to create that Leviathan effect. Now, obviously, push comes to shove, right? I mean, they'll do all sorts of bad things, right? I mean, it did not stop, not stop blue states from trying to shut down churches, right? It did not stop out of control spending during COVID, right? The still having the keys to power can get things done no matter how unpopular it is, as long as the consensus in Washington itself still lives in this kumbaya mode, or at least the majority of Congress still lives in this kumbaya sort of mode, right? But I think in terms of the views of the people, we are seeing crises become increasingly polarized events as well. And I think that is a major strain to, again, this broader notion, this very romantic notion that, democracy is what we all do together.
Right. I agree. And so I guess there are still some like potential crises. Like I do think that for instance, a major terrorist attack that killed a lot of Americans would have that unifying effect, understandably so. And I think that would be used. I also think a recession, like I don't think there's enough of an understanding about what actually would be the cause of that recession. And I think it's similar for the terrorist attack that like, Yeah, like this is something that I've been worried about really since October 7th, or really the response to October 7th is like, if and Scott Horton has talked about this. He's made the great point that, like, if you look back, there was like that whole, not to go on a long tangent here, but there was that whole split in Al Qaeda where some of them were saying like, hey, we need to continue with like this whole mission of kicking the United States completely out of the region before we can form our caliphate. And then an offshoot of that said, no, let's form the caliphate now. That was ISIS. They tried that. The U.S. destroyed that, which, you know, I'm not pro ISIS in any means, but it's sort of it really hit the credibility of those saying, hey, we don't need to continue hitting the U.S. And then like all this stuff is happening in Gaza. I'm pretty worried about something like that. And I think if there's something on a big enough level, it has the potential to, you know, for us to really roll back a few years. I'm worried about that. I think it is our job, you know, with that, with the economic stuff, to really be trying to get people to understand that when these crises happen, it's because of previous policies. And if enough people can see that, like, hey, you know, what the run-of-the-mill propaganda we're getting from DC, that it doesn't make sense like they did during COVID. I think people were pretty unified during like the first 2 weeks of COVID, but like it didn't stick for a long time there. I think you're right. Like that is a dynamic going forward where it is more difficult for the political establishment, and I think that's good. But I think that is something that we have to do. Like that does not just happen spontaneously. It's because that the other point of view has been getting louder and it's been getting more traction. And but I think I guess that's my broader point, is that I see crisis as like the big factor when it comes to, you know, the next couple of years, determining what direction the country is going to go. It's impossible to know what specifically is going to happen, but I think I guess that's how I view all of this and how I try to do my analysis and try to figure out what is productive for us as a movement in terms of you know, our talking points.
Well, it's like if Washington any ideas for any schemes on their end.
Well, I think the Epstein issue has really highlighted an important factor here, and that's the factor that as long as there is this powerful government that has the power to keep secrets, to control information, to perpetuate itself, basically unhindered by the elected government, which is what we have. And this is hardly something that's new to America. It's existed since at least the late 19th century in the West. You had these, essentially in Britain and France, you had these 19th century security states. And that's essentially what caused the Western involvement in World War I, was you had all these secret treaties, you had these secret agreements between the national security states in France and the UK. And that, of course, ended with insane amounts of bloodshed for the common people of those governments, totally unnecessary, totally pointless. And as long as you have those people who are in power, and this is a point Ralph Raico makes in his book, The Struggle for Liberty, is that the Western so-called democracies have huge portions of their government that are they're not democratic, right? They're completely independent. And what they do what they want. They do what they want to control information. They do what they want to perpetuate their own power. And there's essentially no checks and balances against these portions of the government. And that's, as long as you have that, then they're going to be free to do what they want with information like the Epstein list, right? Or that's just the latest example, right? There's so many other things we could point to. Those exist. And as long as a significant portion of Americans think that it's okay for the U.S. government to be run that way, nothing's going to change.
Well, let me push back on that just a little bit, because imagine if this Epstein story had happened in 2004, 2005, right? 20 years ago. Would the public care?
Oh, much less. No, they would have absolutely gone along with it much more so.
It would have been relegated to fringe blogs, which I would have been reading. It would have been talked about in fringe, magazines, right? But nobody would be talking about it. Now they are. And so like their ability to control the narrative through the media side of it. Now, obviously, there's specific documents, right? But there's even plenty of government documents. Again, like when you have like the prosecutor saying, yeah, we can't touch Epstein because it's an intelligence thing, right? Like this is the sort of information that is publicly available now. People are talking about it on platforms that have massive views relative to traditional media, right? And so that's to me, like that's the silver lining here. is that particular dynamic that you're describing has been the truth throughout history. And now, again, 20 years between, I think we've made an entire world of difference in terms of how this specific story would have been treated by the public.
Oh, I definitely agree. Progress has been made on that issue, right? If this were 2005, the U.S. would be involved in a full-blown boots-on-the-ground war with Iran right now. None of this whole, little start and stop war stuff. You yourselves, guys, I'm too old, you'd be being drafted and sent to the Middle East if there wasn't the sort of opposition we see to American foreign policy. Remember, our fathers and grandfathers grew up in an America where that was just standard. Sure, draft my friends. I'm going to graduate from high school soon. I guess I'll be enslaved by the U.S. government and sent by Vietnam. That seems legitimate, I guess. And my parents tell me that's fine, that's patriotic. Almost nobody believes that garbage anymore. No one's going along with that sort of stuff anymore, except the tiny little percentage of diehard, ultra people who think themselves patriotic, but of course they're not. So yeah, huge amounts of progress has been made there. But the Epstein list is a nice example. It's a nice reminder that we're still living under that system and that they are still very much in control of information in a way they shouldn't be. And you're right. At least now there's some pushback. But boy, do we need more of it. All right. Well, with that, I guess we'll go ahead and wrap up this episode. There's plenty more to talk about, I think, and we can just come back to it next week with some other issues.
Ryan, I do have a reminder for our loyal listeners. If you made it this far through the podcast, then you should definitely want to check out our Supporters Summit in Delray Beach, Florida, October 16th through the 18th. We've got a A-class panel of great scholars and thinkers coming in, headlined by James Bovard, who'll be giving our keynote talk. So I think you can see all three of us there in October. So you can learn more at Mises.org/events. And a reminder that coming up, we're going to have Mises University. You yourself can participate with virtual Mises University, free for Mises members. You can find more about that also at the events page at Mises.org/events. And if you're not a Mises member, good time to become one. So check that out at the website as well.
All right. Well, thank you guys for joining me today. Thank you all of you out there for listening to this episode of Power and Market. We'll be back next week with more, so we'll see you next time.